Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Debbie Cox Bolton, CEO of the New Deal, and we are so proud to have you with us today for it's going to be a really interesting conversation on redistricting. As many of you know, the New Deal is a national network of carefully selected state and local leaders across the country who are on the front lines of so many issues, from the pandemic to the recession, to the fight for racial equality, climate change, and increasingly the battle to protect our democracy. We're so proud to lift up their voices and to help them share and spread their good ideas to build an America that works better for everyone. So again, this is an exciting day on in Washington with the bipartisan infrastructure bill being passed. I want to take a moment to just acknowledge that and to tell everyone how happy we are to see that help coming around the country. But today's topic again is part of our Democracy 2021 series. This is our third event in this series. To date, we've looked at what can be done about the unprecedented efforts to subvert voting rights through state legislatures and whether election reforms like ranked choice voting might lead to better representation. Today, of course, we're focusing our attention on redistricting, this once in every 10-year process to redraw the lines for congressional and state legislative districts across the country. And frankly, coming on the heels of the 2020 election and the insurrection in January and these voter suppression efforts, this feels like, and it is, just the stakes are so high to make sure that our democracy and our democratic institutions and processes stay intact. So we're so grateful to have a number of people with us to unpack what's happening around the country. Obviously, this is something that varies very much state by state in terms of the process and who's in charge of drawing the lines. And there's much to talk about in terms of the new rules with Supreme Court cases and other things. So with that, let me just go ahead and introduce, we're going to do, we have a couple experts that we're going to lead off with today, and I'll introduce them. And then we're going to follow that with a number of New Deal leaders from states across the country to talk about what's happening on the ground where they live. We're very thrilled to have with us today these two national experts. First, we'll be hearing from Kelly Ward. She is the president of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, the NDRC, which is chaired by former Attorney General Eric Holder, and is working across the country to achieve fair maps. And she's also president of the NDRC's affiliates, the National Redistricting Action Fund and the National Redistricting Foundation. Prior to that, she spent 4 years as executive director for the DCCC and managed numerous campaigns around the country. We're going to hear from Kelly about what they're keeping an eye on in states that they're particularly active in and what we can do as concerned citizens, as elected officials, to engage in this process. Once Kelly wraps up, we're going to hear from Desiree Tims. Desiree is the president and CEO of Innovation Ohio, which is deeply involved in getting communities to participate in the redistricting process in her state and to ensure that communities of color in particular have fair representation. Prior to joining Innovation Ohio, Desiree worked in the White House and on Capitol Hill, and in 2020, she earned the Democratic nomination for the Ohio's 10th Congressional District. So thank you all for being here. I should mention one other thing, which is we're going to use the Q&A function. If people want to go ahead and ask questions, I will moderate and make sure people get to those. So you feel free to use that as we go along. But Kelly, I'm going to start with you. And again, thanks so much for being with us today.
Great. Well, thank you for having me and for pulling this together. And thank you all for being on the call to listen to this and to care about this issue and to learn more. And it's my great honor also to be here with Desiree and the other esteemed leaders on this call. We're big admirers and fans of your work. And I think you're going to hear a lot of really important information of how people, all of you can get involved in the redistricting process and what is at stake. So thank you for hosting this. It's also very timely to be having this conversation because, as all of you likely know, the redistricting data officially drops this week. So we will get the data that states need in order to officially start the map drawing process and to move forward on that final piece of the redistricting process. And I say final intentionally because, as you're going to hear from the other leaders, there has been a lot of work already happening in the states because the census data was delayed because of the pandemic. We are months behind where we normally would be in the redistricting cycle, and that is has been addressed state by state in different ways, but on net, I think you've seen a really great job in the states of elected officials and commissioners really getting going on the redistricting process, even without the data, and making sure that they are doing commission hearings and committee hearings and starting to hear from the public and getting those wheels turning on redistricting has been happening in the states. But that step that states need to really get the data to then put pen to paper on maps is what's going to happen this week. So we're kind of off to the races, if you will, on redistricting. And so it's very timely to be having this discussion. A couple of top line points that I wanted to share as we level set here is a little bit of what Debbie touched on at the top. The first is that it's really important to understand redistricting in the context of this fight for our democracy that we are seeing around the country right now. Typically a redistricting cycle, it always has to happen after the census is done in the 0 year, and then lines are redrawn in the 1 and 2 years following that census in order to rebalance the population. And that's a thing that our nation has been doing, since the beginning. You have to redistrict. You don't have to gerrymander, which is then to cheat and draw the lines in a way that proactively benefit one party at the expense of the other, largely on the backs of people of color, which we're going to talk about. You don't and shouldn't do that, but you do have to redistrict. But the thing that's happening that we can't ignore is that this redistricting process is happening at a time when we have one party in this country that is intentionally trying to subvert and to undermine the structures of our democracy in order to artificially hold on to their power. And we are seeing that in a range of examples, since the election and with Donald Trump and the big lie. And then since then, the just a large number of voter suppression bills that you've seen throughout the states, that it's all part of a through line for how they can maintain power, not through the voters, but in spite of the voters. And redistricting is the next frontier for them in that fight, where in the states, particularly where the Republicans have total control over the process, you're going to see them continue this trajectory of the voter suppression that we've seen in the states through other forms of legislation through the maps. And gerrymandering is a form of voter suppression. And it's really important to think of it that way, because the way that you see gerrymandering play out is largely through the packing and cracking of communities of color, where you are diluting the impact of minority voters through the maps in a similar way that you're seeing the power of the minority voters be diluted through the voter suppression bills. It's a similar tool to the ends that they are trying to accomplish. And we need to see redistricting in that light. And that is why it's so important to fight this gerrymandering. And you're going to hear from some really esteemed leaders on that, that is what is at stake. That is why this is so important. So we can't think of this as just your sort of standard map drawing politicians, Democrats, Republicans, we're trying to cut deals and try to get maps that benefit one party or another. That is not what's happening. This is, it's an existential threat for Republicans, and they are going to draw maps accordingly. And I think the proof is in the pudding on the other side, which is that what you are seeing from Democratic leaders is a real value in fair redistricting, right? So you are seeing at the national level, Democrats are pushing for the People Act, which would put a ban on partisan gerrymandering. You are seeing state leaders take proactive efforts, even when Democrats have total control, to put stipulations on the redistricting process, to proactively put commissions in place, like we've seen in states like Virginia and Oregon and New Mexico, to really put the proof in the pudding, if you will, that we are not scared of the voters. We are not trying to cheat our way to power. We just want redistricting to be fair. And we are very willing to put commissions or other structures in place that check that intent that you sometimes can see from politicians on redistricting, because we really do want fair maps. And that is what we're fighting for. I think that's what Democrats are fighting for at the national level and all the way down into the states. And the Republicans really are fighting for the opposite. They're fighting to maintain power through the maps. And I think as we go into this discussion and as we think about and go into the redistricting cycle, we have to remember that, and we have to fight accordingly. And that's what we're doing here at the NDRC. We are pushing for fair maps. We are working in the states. We are making sure that people are involved in the process. We're really trying to elevate the significance of redistricting, why it's so important, give people tools to get involved, set a standard for fair maps. Again, we don't want to gerrymander for Democrats. No one should. It's not it's not right. It's not the way that democracy should work. We just want the elections to be fair. We want the lines to be fair so that the outcome of elections are determined by the voters, and that the accountability for who wins is through the voters. And you go make your case to the voters and you have that conversation, and then the lines are fair, the rules are set. And so whoever makes the case the best should win these elections. And that's what we believe. And that's what we're fighting for in the states. So why don't I stop there in terms of just a level set, and really excited to hear from the state leaders who are doing this work on the ground every day.
Thanks so much, Kelly. That's such a great call to action and a reminder of just the stakes. They're so high right now, as you just talked about. I think I might want to come back to you. I'm going to let Desiree speak a little bit Ohio about Ohio specifically, but love to also fill in your knowledge because you're so good at what's happening in every state. So we've got some states covered. We might come back to you for a couple additional thoughts on other states as well, if that's okay with you. But with that, Desiree, thanks so much for being with us and excited to hear about what's happening on the ground in Ohio.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I'm really excited to be here amongst supporters and allies talking about redistricting and what's at stake. As Kelly mentioned, Republicans have control of state legislatures across the country, and they are not against making elections harder for themselves, right? They are not going to play fair. They are not going to play by the rules. And no matter how much or how often we say the people get to pick their politicians and not the other way around, they are going to nonetheless pick the people who they want. And it is our job, it is our duty, it is our right to make sure that we stop that, to make sure that you don't get to divide Black and Brown communities up and cut them up in fourths, to drown out their voice and their votes, to turn them away at the door when they want to advocate for clean water, or fair housing, or access to the vote, to the ballot. And right now we're seeing measures across state legislatures across the country. They're rolling back voting rights. They're trying to take out, for example, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. In Texas, some of the textbooks. I mean, we are seeing the history and the changes that our grandparents and great-grandparents fought for being rolled back right before our eyes. And if we don't do something right now about redistricting, about anti-gerrymandering, stopping them from cheating us out of a democracy, we are going to be in for quite a wake-up call. What we're doing in Ohio is we are pulling the alarm. We are raising and waving all of our flags to show people it is time to step up and really lean into the process. In 2015 and 2018, Ohioans voted in huge numbers to create a fair system by creating a commission to redraw our maps. Now, unfortunately, that commission is comprised of elected who are majority Republican. And so once again, the Republicans are in charge of a process that they will ultimately try to push and make a system and create and design districts that works to their advantage and to the people's disadvantage. So we are encouraging everyday Ohioans to share their story. There's a woman named Mindy in Cincinnati. Her house is in 2 congressional districts. She votes for 1 member of Congress, but when she needs constituent services, she wants to go to Washington, D.C. or get a tour of the White House or get access to a flag or get a tour, they're saying her representative is a different person. And that's because the lines are really drawn across her living room. That's not democracy. That's not representation, but that's what we're up against. And that's what we're fighting. And we have to collectively come together to raise alarms and talk about gerrymandering, redistricting, and why everything is on the line right now. And so I'm really excited and I'm encouraged by seeing what's happening across states around the country, state lawmakers really leaning into the process, and everyday advocates and people standing up saying, no. I get to pick you. You don't pick me. My name's not on the ballot. Your name's on the ballot. And I get to decide if I want you to represent me or not. So we are at a moment where we're looking at Reconstruction 2.0, where we have to redefine our democracy. And it's all on the line. And it's all on the line right now. The literal and proverbial lines that are going to come before us here soon. So as the data is prepared to drop here from the census, and we get to see how many people are in each district and how many people are located where, we want to make sure those people are aware that their voices matter and that they are a part of this process. So I'm all in for equal districts. We have a website, equaldistricts.com, where people can watch videos, they can learn more about the process, and they can pay attention to when community hearings and meetings are happening. Also in Ohio, we had community maps where we had more than 2,000 people draw community maps so that we can show our lawmakers and legislators, look, there are everyday people who were able to draw maps that included their grandmother, their schools, their grocery stores, all in one district. And you can't do it and you're elected. That's a problem. So more people, more power, more progress. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Desiree. And I mean, just while I have you, ask you a follow-up question real fast. And we've started to get some Q&A in the chat. And again, people can use the Q&A function to ask questions themselves. But in terms of what you were talking about making sure those voices are heard in your state, and those very specific, that great anecdote about the persons in 2 districts. Are you finding anything successful in particular? Like, what strategies are you using that you think might be applicable to other states in terms of trying to make the case?
I think that, for example, in Ohio, we voted twice to have a fair process. So people are aware of that gerrymandering is bad, right? And so we don't need to overcomplicate how we explain things to people. We need to tell them, look, we don't want the Republicans to gerrymander your neighborhood. We don't want the Republicans to separate your school from your grocery store. We don't want to separate your kids from bus stops. One kid's at one bus stop and another bus stop because of gerrymandering. I mean, we have to make it plain. And I think sometimes as progressives and Democrats and liberals, we are too smart. And we overcomplicate things that we have to make really plain. The other thing that has worked is having everyday people share their stories. Again, we've been telling regular people's regular stories about how redistricting impacts their lives, and people can relate to that. No one wants to drive 2 hours for constituent services. It also disproportionately impacts communities of color just as much as it does our rural communities, who get thrown into a district that maybe, is 2.5 hours long and they don't have accurate and sufficient transportation. So it's been those everyday stories that have really moved people along the process.
Yeah, that's helpful. And last question, follow up on this piece. I mean, are you, you said that Ohio voted twice, so it's, it's been out there, but are people aware of this? Like, how hard is it to get people to realize that this is an important issue, or are people really on top of that?
I'm not going to say it's easy, because it's not. If it were easy, we wouldn't be here. We just, send out a tweet or something and people would start marching. But it is easier when you tell it and you make it plain. You say, hey, look, you voted for this. Remember this thing. But we had the word gerrymandering on the ballot. And so I think it's very important that us as advocates and people as a collective in this space nationally, that we talk about how this, gerrymandering, redistricting, we kind of have to make the brother-sister relation here and explain why one's better than the other. But anytime you take it away, you start to lose people. And so we have to make sure our message is consistent and concise.
Yeah, thank you for that. We do have a couple questions. I think, Kelly, I'm going to kind of direct these two at you, but Desiree, you should please feel free to hop into. They're a little bit kind of on process questions. The first is just about the timing and the census data once it drops, and how quickly you think you will be able to analyze what comes out, and whether, let's see if I can get this right, there's insights on just basically, what's the process once the data comes out? When will you know, and then how quickly can we turn that around into action?
Sure. Well, let me step back and just explain what's going to happen on Thursday for everyone, which is that normally in the before times, what would happen is that the census would release their redistricting data in Q1 of the year following the census, and they would do it on a rolling basis starting from like February to the end of March of the year, in the 1 year following the census, and that data would be ready and usable for the states right away, and then states are kind of off to the races. The thing that they've changed because of the delay is the data itself is taking longer to process, because of the pandemic. And so that same data where it's ready for redistricting, it's been processed by the Census Bureau, and states can just take it and right away get going on redistricting. That data in that format is not coming until September 30th. But because they want to get the data out to states as fast as possible, what the census is releasing on Thursday is called legacy data, which is the same data. It's the same content. So like this is final data. The actual data won't change. But what's happening on Thursday is this legacy format is like super old school format, right? Like I'm not a data person, but the way that it's described to us is that it's the same data. It's just not as formatted and nicely usable right away as it will be on September 30th. So it takes a level of technical ability to get that data ready for redistricting use. And the census is essentially releasing the raw data out so that other technical experts can do that formatting themselves and then start redistricting quicker than September 30th. That's what's happening on Thursday. It's legacy data. It's the same data though, like don't be confused. So some people, there's confusion around this. There's not like a new different data set coming in September. It's this data. It just takes a little bit of maneuvering and technical work to update the data, format the data to make it usable by states for redistricting. So that process is going to take a few days. And it depends on the state and depends on the level of, like in North Carolina, for example, they have a cluster process that they go through. So in some states, it's going to take a little bit longer to get that formatting ready. But on net, it probably will take a few days to a week to get the legacy data formatted and ready for redistricting. And what's happening in the states is companies like Esri and other big data companies that provide foundations of data, including for redistricting, they are also processing this legacy data. So they will have the data ready. Dave's redistricting tool and some of the public redistricting tools also are going to format the legacy data. So I think within, call it a week to 10 days, the legacy data will be ready and available for usage for redistricting. States also have added their own step. So like legislators, commissioners, there's a process that states are also going through to do the data themselves. So there will be a range, but suffice it to say, everyone is going to be able to use the legacy data within a few days to do redistricting and not have to wait until September 30th. That's what's happening to answer your question and to answer the timeline. And then the other thing I'll add, just that's sort of inherent within the question, is I think there will be a lot of insights on census data that will be shared publicly relatively quickly because you're just going to have so many people analyzing data, looking at data, looking for things like the Hispanic undercount, looking for population insights, not even related to redistricting, right? Just related to the census. So I think you're going to see a lot of news on the census over the next week and 10 days after the data drops. I think there'll be quick analysis and then your sort of longer form analysis. And then the last thing I'll say, sorry to go on about this, but the census will release this data through a webinar that you can watch. And if the reapportionment process in April was any indication, I recommend watching the webinar because they will right away, the Census Bureau leaders right away will share a lot of insight in that webinar, which is on Thursday at 1:00 Eastern, that they live stream. So that's a way also to get some like very quick insight from the census directly on what the data says.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kelly. That's super helpful. And we'll try to make sure that we will circulate the information about that webinar as well. Desiree, did you want to add anything to that just from your Ohio perspective on how you guys are going to be looking at the data?
Yeah, we have some independent groups and institutions that will also be mining the data and looking at it to make sure that our legislators are held accountable in the process and to make sure that people are where they need to be in these districts so that we have the information we need. I think the problem is the September deadline. We have maps to do in September, right? And so we are really behind the ball here with, understanding that the census data is late because of COVID, also because of Donald Trump. But we really are running on a tight timeline. And let's be clear, the Republicans and the conservatives, they already have the maps that they want. to push out. They already know what the lines look like. It is our job to make sure that we are pushing back to make sure the lines are fair. And so this data is really important. Glad that it's coming, this week and not next week. But again, our maps are due in a couple of weeks.
Thank you for that. And quickly, Kelly, for you, we've got a question from a former New Deal leader, Assemblyman, New York Assemblyman David Buchwald, about, is there much recognition in the effort in New York to pass a state constitutional amendment in November to lower the threshold for the state legislature to overturn, to do its own gerrymandering and overturn the Independent Redistricting Commission's work? And is that something you're seeing a recognition of that it's happening? And is that being used, I guess, in other states to kind of justify why gerrymandering should happen? Is that something you guys are watching?
Well, we are watching New York very closely. And I think I would push back a little bit on the premise of the question, which is I don't think that the ballot, the vote in November is to undermine the commission. It is changing the vote threshold that is needed in order to pass the commission maps, and it is lowering it. But if you read the original language from 2014, which I have, it's very confusing. Like the way that the thresholds were written, because it was written at a time when there was mixed control in the legislature, House and Senate. And so they did these like weird mathematical, it's like writing math into policy, which folks on this call are much more familiar with than I am, but it's really a sort of convoluted description of like, if one party controls this chamber, then you have to get this threshold of votes, but if not, then it's this threshold. And it's just like clunky. And so part of what is happening in New York is just cleaning that up. Now, they are cleaning it up by making it a majority vote, certainly, but it's not like undermining the commission. It's not changing the process. It's just clarifying the vote thresholds and making them clearer, which I think on net is a good thing. And we have actually been highlighting New York around the nation, anyone who will listen, because I think New York is a really good example of what I was saying at the top about Democrats putting their money where their mouth is and reforming the redistricting process proactively to make it more fair. And what New York did is they changed both the process by adding in a commission, but they also changed the criteria. And in that ballot initiative in 2014, there is criteria that bans partisan gerrymandering and says you cannot redistrict based on incumbency. And no matter what, that doesn't change. So the criteria of how to draw maps and getting partisan gerrymandering out of the way is still very much intact and not being changed. And New York did that proactively, like even before it was cool, right? They did it in 2014. So I think I think on net, New York is a positive thing. I think changing the threshold is understandable given how convoluted the policy was originally written. And I think we are very supportive of the New York Commission. They've been going through the process already of like touring the state, holding commission hearings, getting public input. And, we're very hopeful that the commission will draw fair maps and the legislature will still pass those fair maps. I also think this is, in New York, I think Democrats are going to pick up seats in New York because I think we're currently underrepresented based on the communities of interest across the state. That's for a different day. But I think it's important to sort of understand that the New York process is a reformed process that was done proactively. And it's one of the few states in the nation that has a state-based partisan gerrymandering ban on the books, which is very cool.
Got it. Thank you. That's super helpful. And I know, Desiree, that you might have to hop off so I just want to acknowledge that we know that and I appreciate you being here. I'll take you for as long as we can get you. But thanks so much for being with us. And I'd love to turn now. We have some great New Deal leaders from all over the country to talk about what's happening in their specific states. As Kelly was mentioning, or in both Desiree and Kelly were mentioning, obviously places where there's total Republican control are the most concerning in terms of this partisan gerrymandering. So I think I'd love to start with Loranne Ausley, Senator from Florida, here with us to ask Loranne about what's happening in Florida and what you're seeing and what we can expect.
Thanks, Deb. Can you hear? Yeah, okay, you can hear me. Yep. Okay, so just the basics here in Florida. The Constitution requires our timing, which is the second legislative session after the census. So January 2022, we're on track for that. all maps are drawn by the state legislature, which in Florida, as you all know, we have significant Republican majorities in both houses. The Senate is 34 to 16, the House is 78 to 42. And the troubling piece of this is we have some vacancies. We have one vacancy in the Senate and 2 vacancies in the House because people have resigned to run for other offices. And it's unclear whether those are going to be filled in time to give us those votes that are needed. Our congressional maps are created by law and can be vetoed by the governor, unlikely in this scenario. And the state ledge maps are created by joint resolution, so the governor has no veto power. Obviously, the Supreme Court has a review on all the maps. In 2010, the voters, we added to the Constitution the fair districts provisions, which they set specific standards about, you can't intentionally favor or disfavor political party or incumbent, protecting voting rights of racial and language minorities, requiring contiguous compact as equal in population as is practicable, and trying to make sure that we're using existing political and geographic boundaries. So that, the maps are supposed to be drawn to those provisions, but again, they're going to be drawn by significantly Republican majority legislators. Historically, there have been significant public hearings around the state. I spoke to the chair of the committee today, who assures me that is in the plans. But we're behind schedule like everyone. And so we at this moment, there have not been any committee members named to either the Senate or the House redistricting committees. The chairs have been named, and it is expected that the other members will be named before in our September committee meetings, and then we'll start meeting. What remains to be seen, frankly, is how transparent is this going to be, given the political situation here in Florida, which you all read about every day. So. But I wish I had more information to tell you, but that's what I know at the moment.
Yeah, that's super helpful, Loranne. Thank you. I appreciate that. And we'll see if people have specific questions for you, but it's just helpful to understand what the timeline and the process is. And you brought up the Supreme Court in Florida. Again, that's another place where it depends on the state you're in. Right now that the federal folks have taken themselves out and said no, partisan gerrymandering is fine. We're not going to weigh in on that. States, depends on where your state is and what kind of things the courts are going to weigh in, which takes us to Pennsylvania, another state where we have, some concerns about, I think, what's going to happen there. But the Supreme Court has weighed in on that. So maybe, Jordan, you can kind of tell us a little bit about where you are in the process and what you anticipate over the next coming weeks as this new data drops.
So first of all, thank you so much for having me. Such a pleasure to be with you and all of my friends here at the NewDEAL leaders from across the country. Let me start by saying this, and because I've been listening, power concedes nothing without demand. It never did and never will. Frederick Douglass said that, and it is so relevant even today in the midst of the conversation around gerrymandering, around voter suppression. Just last week, I was in Washington, D.C. with our brothers and sisters, our siblings down in D.C. from the Texas House who had to flee their state so that they would not be forced to vote on another voter suppression bill coming out of a state legislature throughout this country. We had one that came out of Pennsylvania. Luckily, we have a Democratic governor, so we were able to veto that. But I was just in DC last week with state legislators from across the country who were standing with our friends in Texas, standing in solidarity with them and urging the United States Congress, primarily the Senate, to pass a federal voting rights bill to actually protect voting for all of us across this country. So you take that part of voter suppression and then you marry that with gerrymandering. As someone said earlier, gerrymandering is a form of voter suppression. So when you look at what we have here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we have both our chambers, House and Senate, controlled by Republicans with a Democratic governor. So we have two different processes for our redistricting. Our state legislative seats are done by a 5-member commission. The 5 members of that commission are the leaders of each of our caucus. So House Democrats and Republicans, Senate Democrats and Republicans, and then our Supreme Court gets to pick one person to be on that commission. Our Supreme Court is controlled by Democrats, so that Supreme Court picks the 5th person for that commission. That commission then draws the lines, and that's how we come up with our legislative lines. We anticipate, though, that they will be challenged in court. They always are, and then it will go to our Supreme Court. For our congressional lines, that is a byproduct of just the legislative process. There is a bill that comes out that has the lines drawn for our congressional maps that we, the legislature, must pass and that the governor must sign. Also, the court can play a role in that. And last go around, we had the court throw out congressional lines in Pennsylvania, and our Supreme Court actually drew their own congressional lines because the congressional lines were so gerrymandered. But let me bring up another point that is that we have in Pennsylvania. We have prison gerrymandering in Pennsylvania, where the prison population is calculated where the prison is. So let me explain that. You can be from Philadelphia, right? Get sent to one of our 26 state correctional facilities. Wherever you are housed, you are counted as being a resident or constituent in that district. For example, we have a county called Forest County, Pennsylvania. Forest County, Pennsylvania, 30% of Forest County's population is actually the prisoners who are in SCI Forest County. So not only are we fighting gerrymandering, but we're fighting places like Philadelphia losing substantial population because our brothers and sisters and siblings who are incarcerated, they're not counted as Philadelphia residents. They're counted in whatever county that they're housed. And many of those counties are rural counties represented by Republicans. So this benefits them even more because now they actually have less constituents because they're counting the prisoners, and it even helps them gerrymander even more.
That's super interesting, Jordan. I was not aware of that that fact. So that thank you for raising that, and thanks for letting us know what's happening there. I'm going to continue kind of with the round robin, and then we'll open it back up, or I'll come back with some questions at the end that we have time. But really appreciate you being here to tell us what the process is there and what we should be looking for. Let me stick with another state where Republicans are in control of the process, and that's Kentucky. We have with us Representative Nima Kulkarni. And Nima, for you, I wanted to start also by saying that one of the interesting things I've been reading a bit has been this idea of trying to split cities up. We talked a little bit about that earlier, about representation and communities of color, communities of interest. And I saw Louisville as an example of one of the places they might be looking to do that. So what's happening on the ground where you are?
So welcome from Louisville, Kentucky, a blue dot in a very red ocean. One of the things that I want to reiterate is the importance of not just voting in congressional, races, voting for like these large name races. We are here where Republicans control majority of state legislatures because they've been planning this for decades. This doesn't just happen overnight. In Kentucky, we lost the majority in the House just in 2016. So it didn't even happen a really, really long time ago. And it's really important, I think, to connect the dots of why people need to be counted in the census. We had a really difficult time explaining to people why they should just go ahead and be counted because they weren't able to connect the dots that right now in redistricting is where the rubber meets the road in terms of their electoral power. And so when you're talking about redistricting, we have in our state house a 75 to 25 Republican majority. In our state Senate, we have a 30-8 Republican majority, and we have 6 congressional districts. So In our state constitution, we do have, I think Loranne also mentioned that Florida has this, we need contiguity and a preservation of political subdivisions. There was a Politico article that talked about Mitch McConnell wanting to preserve Congressman Yarmouth's district, and it's Louisville, right? So you have 6 congressional districts, which Kentucky was allowed to keep because we had an increase of about 3.8% in population, which wasn't enough to gain a seat. But we didn't lose a seat either. And that, I just want to quickly point out, is reapportionment versus redistricting. And that is actually based on population count. And so, what's happened in Kentucky is there's been a move and a loss of population in Eastern and Western Kentucky. And you're kind of moving inward towards Louisville, Lexington, Northern Kentucky, and Bowling Green increasingly. So that's where the populations have grown. In the 40th district, I'm about 1,500 short of the number, which the most recent census count has Kentucky at about 4.5 million, which means you want about 45,000 in each legislative district. We have 100 of those in the House, 38 in the Senate, in the Constitution. And so those can't really be changed. So you're redistricting those lines, but what you've got is a majority of Republican legislators. So they're having to figure out, where do they consolidate, who is going to be representing which district, because the population shifts are very, very clear. And they're moving towards these areas that are urban centers and their surrounding counties. So you've got, again, in Lexington, you have a growth at plus 8,000, or in Northern Kentucky, you have a plus 9,000. And so those numbers will need to be shifted to outside to where actually Republicans are legislating right now. So what they're having to deal with is, I think, an interesting issue. I don't know if that's going to be enough to delay any of the legislative maps. I think, as Desiree said, they probably got all of their maps drawn and will just sort of insert whatever the latest census data is that they need to. But in terms of sort of moving cities or drawing lines across cities, we do have that contiguity provision in the Constitution. So they will probably not be able to do that on the legislative level. And on a political level, I doubt that they're going to try to break up Louisville into different congressional districts, because it's blue. It's the only blue kind of place that they have. And I don't know that any Republican congressmen want more Democratic precincts in their districts. And so that's something that we're going to be seeing, I think, not just in the congressional shift, but also in the legislative shift. So you're going to see maybe keeping Louisville districts the same, keeping Lexington districts the same, some Northern Kentucky districts the same, unless they're already surrounded by Republican legislators. And so that's something that is an interesting conundrum. I do not know whether they will be fair maps. I don't really see the need for the Republican Party, with such a large majority, try to get more than they need to and then run afoul of the Constitution. I don't know if that's really kind of the question that we're facing, is, are they going to do that and risk a challenge in court, or are they just going to redistrict based on their current legislative lines and the maps, because they have, again, 75 to 25 majority in the House and a 30 to 8 majority in the Senate. Our session is in 22, like everyone else. Everything has been delayed, and I think that they have enough numbers to pass all their maps in a few days. Our legislative session starts on the 3rd, and we actually moved our deadline to file for office to the 7th. So it's going to also be interesting when and how these maps are approved. They have enough to override a gubernatorial veto, because we do have a Democratic governor, but we do not have enough members to sustain that veto. So that's kind of where we are in Kentucky in terms of where they're going to be drawing the lines. It's really, I think, based a lot on the population shift. And it's going to be, I think, concentrating, right? Instead of kind of, somebody used the phrase packing and cracking or something similar to that. It's going to be concentrating, kind of corralling Democratic votes throughout Kentucky, so that you're only going to be able to have Democratic representatives in these population centers and these urban centers, and the rest of Kentucky will continue to be Republican. And so that is something that I think we're not going to really be able to change until we're able to connect in voters' minds the importance of being counted in the census, the importance of voting in every single election, including midterms, the importance of making sure that your representatives, you know who your representatives are, and that they're reflecting what your concerns are and your values are, because all of it is connected, right? If you vote for somebody and they're not willing to fund public education, that's going to impact your life. If you vote for somebody and they're not going to be a proactive representative and vote for legislation that helps clean air, clean water, healthy soil, that's going to impact you and your children's lives. And so I think this connecting the dots narrative is something that we have lost in Kentucky as Democrats. And the only way that we're going to see a shift back towards any kind of a fair and balanced representation throughout our state is to make sure we get those voters back. And I'm an immigration attorney in my day job, and I always push this idea that we have got to be able to harness the migration patterns globally. There's a reason they put a lot of effort into scaring undocumented people from not answering the census questions. There's a reason they wanted to put a citizenship question on the census. They want to discourage these sort of underlying pillars of democracy so that this conversation about how they could be unfair and how they can be unconstitutional in their representation keeps going on and perpetuating itself. And it's up to us to change voters' minds and educate them as much as possible so that this next conversation hopefully will not be the same.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nima. That's so powerful and so important. And it's thanks too for the reminder. I mean, I know everyone on this call knows this, but obviously so much of the redistricting conversation ends up talking about the U.S. House and control of the U.S. House, and clearly that's super important and critical, particularly right now in the world in which we live in. But it also will redraw the state legislative lines, which then in turn will decide next census, right? So, I mean, it really is this perpetual thing that it just has to be addressed and has to be acknowledged. So thanks so much for your comments. I want to go, we've got 2 other states we want to touch on before the end of our time together. So I'm just going to keep going through. These 2 states both have commissions who are drawing the lines. 2 very different states though. We've got Colorado. Maybe we'll start with this is not their first time around with a commission. We've got Representative Dylan Roberts to tell us a little bit about what's happening in your very important swing state there.
Thanks, Debbie, and thanks for having me on. Really enjoyed listening to everybody who's talked so far. So I'm Dylan Roberts. I'm out here in Colorado, member of the State House. As Debbie alluded to, we do have an independent redistricting commission here in Colorado. This is our first time going through it, though. Okay. The legislature in 2018, we referred 2 measures to the ballot to ask voters, should we have a redistricting commission, and put it in our Constitution. They passed overwhelmingly back in 2018 of over 70% for both congressional and legislative. And so now we're going through this process that we've never done before, but it is, so it's definitely, confusing and new for everybody, but essentially what it is the commission is made up of 12 members for the congressional and then 12 totally separate members for the legislative. And each commission is 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 4 unaffiliated, but they are not politicians. Is it explicit that they could not be legislators? They are not former legislators. They are not anybody who's worked on campaigns. It is, there are a lot of rules on who could apply, and it's trying to get at people who are as less self-interested, if you will, as possible in this process. And so those were picked back earlier in the year. And then starting in July, the staff of the legislature came up with a first round of maps. And basically they said, here's the starting point based off of the criteria that is set forth in the constitutional amendments. By the way, the criteria we put in our Constitution are that the commission should do their best to maximize competitive districts to the extent possible, but also just as importantly, focus on communities of interest and maximizing minority representation. So that means not splitting up towns or counties when possible. That means being mindful of where minority communities live and not doing things to deliberately separate them. And so the staff came up with their preliminary map, and then the commission has been hitting the road since July. They are doing 35 meetings all across the state to get input from the public. Those have already started. Some have lasted 5 or 6 hours and gone well past midnight. Some have been less well attended. It kind of depends where in the state they are and what part of the map they're talking about. And then at the end of August, they'll conclude those meetings, and then the commission will start redrawing the maps based off of the input that they heard. Their original deadline was to submit final maps to the Supreme Court by September 1st, but because of the census delay, they just got that delayed to October 1st. In order for a map to be adopted, 8 out of the 12 commissioners need to vote in favor of that map. If they can get at least 8 votes, then it will go to the Supreme Court. And the only jurisdiction the Supreme Court has to review is whether to make sure that they didn't intentionally violate the parameters of the constitutional amendment as far as competitiveness and communities of interest goes. If they cannot get 8 votes, then the staff of the legislature will submit maps to the best of their ability based on public input and where the discussions were going. And then the Supreme Court would have a little bit more power to approve those maps. But at the end of the day, we're hoping to have this done. The final date is December 29th of 2021 is when Colorado should have their maps finalized and approved by the Supreme Court. Everybody's hoping that that timeline is still realistic, and we're moving forward. Certainly some people, we're a fully democratically controlled state in Colorado, which is different than a lot of the states that have talked. And so there are some Democrats who selfishly think that we gave away all of our power because we would have been able to draw the maps as a legislature. But I think for the interest of democracy and all the reasons that have been stated, this is the right way to go. Even though it's the first time and there's some kinks for sure, in the long run, this is the right way to go forward for our state. So I'm happy to be on and share that update from Colorado.
Thanks so much, Dylan. Really appreciate having you. And it's so interesting. And this is the state by state, battle really, and the state by state process. And, every state's so different. So it's helpful just to get a lay of the land. We're going to complete our tour around the country here. We're going to Michigan. Representative Mari Manoogian is with us. So nice to see you, Mari.
Great to see you too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. And you also have a new commission. So they're drawing the lines. Tell us what's happening there and if there are concerns that you're keeping an eye on.
Yeah, so in our state in Michigan in 2018, we passed what we call Proposal 2, otherwise known sort of colloquially here as Voters Not Politicians. That was sort of the organization that led the effort to get Proposal 2 onto the ballot. And then, of course, it passed overwhelmingly here in our state for a nonpartisan independent redistricting commission. So it's made up of 13 commissioners. It was chosen in 2020 by sort of a lottery. Folks applied. You couldn't be a current or former elected official or an immediate family member of an elected official or a current employee of like a government, a campaign, political party, or a current or former lobbyist as well. And our state had over 9,300 applicants to the Redistricting Commission, which really shows, us here in Michigan that there's a great deal of enthusiasm for the process. Folks are really excited about the opportunity to be part of sort of this historic first commission that draws these maps independently for the first time without a partisan slant to them. And so over the past year, they've spent time hosting meetings. They've gone to like meet and greets and different things throughout our districts. For example, I spoke at a local community meeting for Bloomfield Township. And the folks who spoke before me came from the Redistricting Commission to sort of give an update and sort of an overview of what the commission is doing. So they've done a really good job of trying to educate the public about the process, which was really interesting. And sort of similar to what Representative Roberts was saying out in Colorado, we have some questions around when these maps will get drawn, and sort of the overarching theme being from everyone here that was speaking about the lack of data coming in time from the census and what that might do to the process of the map drawing. At this point, there were the Redistricting Commission, I believe, went to the state Supreme Court to ask for an extension on when the final maps could be released. So we have a November 1st deadline here, and it's August 10th. So we're fast approaching this November 1st deadline. And the state Supreme Court said, look, like if you get to this deadline and you haven't met it yet, we'll revisit this, but we don't want to rule on a hypothetical because it could open us up to ruling on hypothetical situations for a myriad of other issues. in the future. And so what we are looking toward here in Michigan would be sort of in the first couple of weeks of September. It's a little bit nebulous, but we're looking at seeing our first iteration of the maps, being presented to the public, and then they will go on a roadshow again. So similar to what they were doing in Colorado, the commissioners held sort of a roadshow of sorts of events throughout the state. Again, similar to what Representative Roberts was saying about his state. Some of those events were really well attended. I know the ones in Southeast Michigan, so I represent a Southeast Michigan district. The ones in Southeast Michigan were incredibly well attended. Folks made their case about, what their different House districts looked like, whether or not they thought they were drawn fairly 10 years ago, and what could be done now to make them more fair. We, similar to what's in Colorado, we have what folks are calling communities of interest. So different organizations are submitting their versions of nonpartisan drawn maps to the commission. So for example, just a couple days ago, we saw the AFL-CIO here in Michigan submit their maps. And even, most folks think that because they're a labor organization, they may be more left leaning. Even the maps they submitted still had a little bit of a Republican bias to them, simply because, and I use bias, I don't even think that's the right word, just simply because of the way that, they sort of envisioned communities of interest in their map, and then sort of looked at the way that the population was spread out across the state. That's sort of what that looked like. And so we're sort of waiting to see what some of those submissions look like. And then we're going to look forward to the beginning of September to see the first iteration of the maps. We actually got to watch on Thursday the commission learn how to use map making software to draw the maps. So that was really entertaining. They live stream all of their meetings. So those, if you're excited about gerrymandering or redistricting and want to study it a little bit closer, you can watch all of those meetings live streamed on Twitter and on their Facebook page, actually, and really follow closely along to what the commissioners are up to. So here in Michigan, we're looking forward to seeing what's going on in September, and then sort of waiting with bated breath to see if those final maps will come out by that November 1st deadline. But there has been a little bit of chatter, sort of similar with what's going on in other states about, will we have ample time to run our primaries and ample time to run our elections with these new maps? In Michigan, our primary is actually in August. So it's a rather late primary. It's a very long primary season and a very compressed general election season here in our state. So, we're looking at maybe changing filing deadlines, but not changing when that primary might be, considering the fact that it's usually that first Tuesday in August. So that's sort of what the lay of the land is here in Michigan. Again, we're just sort of waiting to see what these initial maps look like in the first coming weeks next month.
Thanks so much, Mari. It's great to really appreciate you being here. I know we're kind of right at our time, and we did get around the horn with states. I really appreciate all the New Deal leaders who are here. Kelly, if you're still here, Ward Burton, I'd love to let you have the final word after hearing that those comments from around the state, around the country. Just in closing, are there anything we should be watching out for when this data drops in particular, and anything you would tell us? Obviously every state's so different, but anything you would tell us for those of us who care so much about this, and we've already talked about the stakes, what we should be doing in the weeks to come.
Sure. Well, I have to say, I personally am very fired up about this because we talk about these states and these processes every day. And so to hear from all of you where you're on the front lines, you're like doing the work, you're like deep in, I'm very inspired by you. So I hope the other people on the call are too. It brings to life, what I feel like our folks internally and the volunteers that we work with are all, just really involved and feel it in our hearts, but y'all are just doing the work in the states on the ground, and it's so inspiring. So thank you for everything you're doing, and you're inspiring folks like me every day. And then so that's number one. Number two is, as you're hearing, every state is different, and this is going to play out in a state by state way, but there is the chance for involvement to influence this process, and that is like right now. And so one of the things I think is really encouraging about the redistricting process is that it is a inherently public process that goes through some type of either legislature or commission. And so by definition, the public needs to be involved. This is democracy. And as you're hearing on this call, we sort of have to do democracy to save democracy, right? And that's what this is about. And so for the electeds on the call, thank you for the work that you're doing every day to be on the front lines. For everyone else, please get involved in this. It will happen and then it will end. It's kind of like a campaign. And so the opportunity to engage, to lift up your voices, to, participate and to really have an impact on these outcomes, as you're hearing from the elected officials, is right now. And it really can and will matter. So please get involved. We are a vehicle to get involved for any folks on the ground. So, hit me up. Our website, allontheline.org, is a really good tool for mobilization and for advocacy around redistricting. And so just thank you all for the work that you're doing and for the busy and exciting couple of months that we will all be facing as we all draw maps around the country. But there is hope, and we can really,
I feel a little more hopeful after this conversation.
Yeah, we can have a good impact. There's no question. And and no matter what, we will keep fighting. So
thank you. Well, thank you for all the work you do. Thank you, your organization. Thanks for being with us today. Again, I will echo what Kelly said about just appreciating so much all of the New Deal leaders on the front lines, the ones we heard from and those we didn't, who are all over the country working on this. Thank you so much. And we will continue to talk about this and make sure that you have access to information and to resources if you want to get more involved. So thanks everyone for being with us today, and we'll talk to you all real soon.